It was an early autumn morning when Mark Thompson arrived at Thompson's Table, the small but thriving restaurant he had poured his life into for the past 12 years. The sun had barely risen, casting a warm golden glow over the sleepy town of Ridgewood. Mark unlocked the doors with his usual routine, taking a deep breath of the crisp air before stepping inside. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans and the faint aroma of bread from the bakery down the street greeted him as he prepared for another busy day. Mark had always believed his restaurant was more than just a place to eat. It was a gathering spot for the community, where families celebrated milestones, friends caught up over dinner, and locals stopped by to grab a meal made with care. He prided himself on his menu, a mix of hearty classics and creative specials, sourced from local farms and suppliers. The walls were adorned with photos of Ridgewood's history, a nod to his father, who had always told him, "Never forget where you come from." But this day wasn't destined to be like the others. It began when Mark stepped out back to check a delivery from a nearby farm. As he inspected the boxes of fresh produce, he heard a faint but growing noise coming from the street. Curious, he walked to the front of the restaurant and froze. A group of about 20 people, mostly young adults, stood across the street, holding signs with bold slogans, "Meat is murder," "End animal cruelty," and "Go vegan or go home." Mark's heart sank. He had seen protests like this on the news before, but he never imagined one would happen outside his restaurant. His pulse quickened as he scanned the group, trying to spot a familiar face. Ridgewood was a small town, and though it had its share of activists, this level of confrontation felt alien. The protesters chanted loudly, their voices echoing off the nearby buildings. A few curious onlookers stopped to watch, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Mark's regulars, still half asleep and clutching their morning coffee cups, paused in confusion. Mark's assistant manager, Beth, walked up behind him, her brows furrowed. "What's going on out there?" she asked. "I'm not sure," Mark replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "But it looks like we've got a problem." Beth stepped outside to get a closer look. One of the protesters, a young woman with fiery red hair and a megaphone, caught her eye. "People of Ridgewood," the woman shouted, her voice amplified and commanding attention. "We're here to take a stand against the exploitation of animals. This restaurant profits from cruelty and destruction. Join us in saying no to this outdated and harmful industry." Mark clenched his jaw. He had nothing against vegans or their choices, his menu even included a handful of plant-based options, but this felt personal. He couldn't help but feel the weight of their accusations, even if he didn't agree with them. As the morning wore on, the protest grew. More people joined the group, and their chants became louder. Cars slowed down as drivers gawked at the commotion. Some honked in support, while others shook their heads and drove on. Inside the restaurant, the staff scrambled to keep up with the breakfast rush. The protesters were becoming a distraction, and a few customers had already complained about the noise. One older man, a regular named Frank, muttered, "Can't even enjoy my coffee in peace these days," before leaving in a huff. Mark tried to focus on running the restaurant, but his mind kept drifting back to the scene outside. By late morning, the group had set up a table with pamphlets and posters depicting graphic images of factory farming. Though Mark's restaurant sourced its meat from humane farms, the protesters didn't seem interested in nuance. At noon, the local news station arrived. A reporter and cameraman set up across the street, interviewing the protest leader, who introduced herself as Sarah. Her articulate arguments and passionate demeanor quickly won over some of the bystanders. Mark watched from the kitchen window, his frustration mounting. He knew he needed to address the situation, but how? Confronting the protesters directly could escalate the conflict, but ignoring them wasn't an option either. By mid-afternoon, the protest had drawn a crowd. Some were there to support the cause, while others simply wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Social media posts about the protest began to circulate, and soon people from neighboring towns started showing up to take part. Mark's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends and colleagues, all asking the same question: "What's going on at your restaurant?" As the day wore on, Mark decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He stepped outside, squaring his shoulders as he approached the protesters. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. The chanting stopped, and all eyes turned to him. "My name is Mark Thompson," he continued. "I'm the owner of this restaurant. I'd like to understand what this is all about." Sarah stepped forward, her expression a mix of determination and disdain. "We're here because your business contributes to the exploitation and suffering of animals," she said. "People need to know the truth, and we're not going to stop until they do." Mark nodded, trying to keep his composure. "I respect your right to protest," he said. "But I also believe in honest dialogue. Have any of you ever been inside my restaurant? Have you looked at where I source my ingredients?" The question seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She hesitated before replying, "It doesn't matter where your ingredients come from. If you serve animal products, you're part of the problem." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement while others looked unsure. Mark seized the moment. "Look," he said, "I understand your passion for this cause. But painting every restaurant with the same brush doesn't help anyone. My suppliers are local farmers who care deeply about the environment and their animals. I'm open to having a conversation about how we can do better, but this," he gestured to the signs and the chanting, "isn't productive." Sarah's expression hardened. "We're not here to negotiate," she said. "We're here to hold you accountable." Before Mark could respond, a voice from the crowd shouted, "Why don't you prove it? Show us what you're really about." Mark paused, the challenge hanging in the air. He glanced at the restaurant behind him, then back at the protesters. An idea began to form in his mind, an idea that could either defuse the situation or backfire spectacularly. "I'll tell you what," he said, his voice steady. "Why don't you all come inside tomorrow evening? I'll host a special event just for you. I'll prepare a menu that aligns with your values, and we can have an open discussion about what's possible. If you still think I'm the enemy after that, so be it." The crowd buzzed with mixed reactions. Sarah looked skeptical but intrigued. "And what's the catch?" she asked. "No catch," Mark replied. "Just an opportunity to talk, and to eat." Sarah exchanged glances with her fellow protesters before nodding. "Fine," she said. "We'll be here." As the protesters began to disperse, Mark felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He had bought himself some time, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Inside the restaurant, Beth looked at him with wide eyes. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "No," Mark admitted. "But if we're going to get through this, we need to find common ground. And maybe, just maybe, this is the way to do it." That night, as Mark sat in his office, he began planning the menu for what would undoubtedly be the most important dinner of his career. Little did he know, the events of the coming days would change his life, and his community, forever. The following day arrived with an air of tension and anticipation. Mark Thompson woke up earlier than usual, his mind a storm of thoughts about the upcoming event. Hosting the protesters for a dinner was a gamble, but he believed it was better than letting the conflict spiral out of control. If anything, it was a chance to humanize the conversation, to show that his restaurant wasn't the faceless institution they seemed to believe it was. The morning was quiet, almost eerily so. The usual breakfast crowd came and went, many offering supportive words after witnessing the commotion the day before. "Don't let them get to you, Mark," said Mrs. Henderson, an elderly regular who had been coming to Thompson's table since it opened. "You're one of the good ones." Mark appreciated the sentiment, but he knew it wasn't about being good or bad in the eyes of his community. To the protesters, he was a symbol of an industry they opposed, and no amount of local goodwill would change that. By mid-afternoon, Mark and his staff began preparing for the evening. The atmosphere in the kitchen was tense. Beth, his assistant manager, kept casting him wary looks as she coordinated the prep work. "You really think this is going to work?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. "I don't know," Mark admitted, chopping a mound of vegetables with more force than necessary. "But I'd rather try to bridge the gap than let this turn into a shouting match. If nothing else, maybe we can plant a seed of understanding." Beth sighed. "I hope you're right. But something about this feels off. They're so angry, Mark. What if they're just looking for an excuse to make a scene?" Mark didn't have an answer for that. He had thought about the possibility himself. But he couldn't shake the feeling that avoiding the conversation entirely would only give the protesters more ammunition to discredit him. The menu for the evening was a mix of vegan and vegetarian dishes, carefully crafted to highlight local, plant-based ingredients. Mark wanted to show the protesters that he wasn't their enemy, that he understood and respected their values even if he didn't share all of them. He even spent hours researching vegan cuisine the night before, trying to ensure the dishes were not only ethical but delicious. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the streets of Ridgewood in a warm amber glow, the first of the protesters arrived. Sarah, the fiery leader who had dominated the previous day's demonstration, walked in with an air of defiance. She was followed by a handful of others, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The dining area had been rearranged to accommodate them, with a long table set up in the center of the room. It was adorned with simple yet elegant decor, wooden placemats, small potted succulents, and handwritten menu cards for each guest. Mark greeted them at the door, his demeanor calm and professional. "Thank you for coming," he said, extending a hand to Sarah. She hesitated for a moment before shaking it. "We're not here to be won over," she said bluntly. "I understand," Mark replied. "I just hope you'll give me a chance to show you who I really am, and what this restaurant stands for." The protesters took their seats, their movements stiff and guarded. The room was silent except for the clinking of glasses as Beth poured water for each guest. Mark stood at the head of the table, addressing the group. "Before we begin, I want to thank you for being here. I know we come from different perspectives, but I believe there's value in having this conversation face to face. Tonight's menu is entirely plant-based, sourced from the same local farms I've worked with for years. My hope is that we can find common ground, not as adversaries, but as people who care about the world we live in." The protesters exchanged glances, some nodding slightly, others maintaining their skeptical expressions. The first course was served, a vibrant beet carpaccio with arugula, toasted walnuts, and a citrus vinaigrette. The plates were met with cautious curiosity. Some of the protesters hesitated to eat, as if expecting a hidden agenda in the food itself. Sarah took a tentative bite, her expression softening slightly as she tasted the dish. "This is good," she admitted reluctantly. Mark smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'm glad you think so." As the evening progressed, the tension in the room began to thaw, though it didn't disappear entirely. The second course, a creamy butternut squash soup with coconut milk and a drizzle of truffle oil, earned murmurs of approval. By the time the main course arrived, a hearty wild mushroom risotto topped with fresh herbs, the atmosphere had shifted from confrontational to cautiously curious. It was during dessert, a decadent chocolate avocado mousse with a sprinkle of sea salt, that Sarah finally spoke up. "I'll admit," she said, setting down her spoon, "this meal has been incredible. But it doesn't change the fact that your restaurant still profits from the exploitation of animals. How do you justify that?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Mark. He took a deep breath before responding. "I believe in balance," he said. "I believe in supporting local farmers who treat their animals and land with respect. I understand your concerns, and I share many of them. That's why I've worked hard to ensure my suppliers align with ethical practices. But I also believe that change doesn't happen through division. It happens through dialogue, through finding ways to meet in the middle." Sarah frowned, her expression a mix of frustration and thoughtfulness. "Dialogue is important, yes," she said. "But what you're asking for is compromise. And compromise means accepting the continuation of harm." Before Mark could respond, another protester spoke up. "But isn't this meal a form of compromise?" he asked, his voice tentative. "He didn't have to do this for us. Maybe it's worth considering that not everyone in this industry is the enemy." The group fell into a heated discussion, their voices overlapping as they debated the merits of Mark's approach. Some remained steadfast in their opposition, while others seemed to waver, their rigid stances softening in the face of his efforts. As the evening drew to a close, Mark handed out small jars of homemade vegan pesto as a token of gratitude. "I know we didn't resolve everything tonight," he said. "But I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation. My door is always open." The protesters left in small groups, their expressions a mix of contemplation and unresolved tension. Sarah was the last to leave. She paused at the door, turning back to face Mark. "You surprised me tonight," she admitted. "I still don't agree with you, but you surprised me." Mark smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's enough." As the door closed behind her, Mark leaned against the counter, exhaustion washing over him. Beth approached, a look of cautious optimism on her face. "I think you might have gotten through to some of them," she said. "Maybe," Mark replied. "But even if I didn't, I hope I showed them that we're not as divided as they think." That night, as Mark locked up the restaurant, he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. The protesters had come expecting a fight, but they left with something else entirely, something that might just plant the seed of change, even if it took time to grow. Unbeknownst to Mark, however, the events of the evening had set off a chain reaction that would soon spiral beyond his control. Social media posts about the dinner began to circulate, some praising his efforts to engage with the protesters, others condemning him for what they saw as a concession to their demands. And somewhere, in the growing digital storm, a new challenge was quietly taking shape, one that would test Mark's resolve and force him to confront not just the protesters, but his own beliefs about the world he had worked so hard to build. The aftermath of the protest dinner was anything but quiet. By the next morning, Ridgewood was abuzz with whispers of the event, and the internet had caught wind of it, too. Sarah and her group had posted extensively about their experience, and while the reviews were mixed, the reach was undeniable. Some posts praised Mark for his willingness to engage in dialogue. Thompson's Table proves that compassion exists on both sides. Others, however, painted him as a manipulative figure trying to disarm the vegan movement with charm and good food. Mark scrolled through the posts on his phone, his heart sinking at the vitriol in some of the comments. Words like sellout, hypocrite, and propaganda disguised as dinner popped up repeatedly. Yet, there were also glimmers of hope, comments from people who saw value in his effort to bridge the divide. Beth, standing at the counter with a steaming cup of coffee, watched him with concern. "You need to stop reading those, Mark. It's just going to stress you out." "I know," he said, setting his phone down with a sigh. "I just didn't think it would blow up like this. I thought it was just dinner." "Dinner with people who've been itching for a fight," Beth reminded him. "You can't expect everyone to see it the way you do." The day passed slowly, the restaurant quieter than usual. Mark suspected that many of his regular customers were staying away, either wary of the controversy or waiting to see how it all played out. But the lull gave him time to reflect, and by the afternoon, he had resolved to carry on as usual. However, the universe had other plans.
Just as the lunch crowd began to trickle in, a young man in a crisp suit walked through the door. His demeanor was sharp, his expression unreadable. He introduced himself as Daniel Meyer, a journalist for a popular online news outlet. "I'm writing a piece about your dinner with the protesters," Daniel said, his tone neutral, but his eyes keen. "Would you be willing to answer a few questions?" Mark hesitated. On one hand, media attention could amplify the positive aspects of what he had done. On the other, it could just as easily backfire. Still, he knew he couldn't avoid the spotlight forever. "Sure," he said, motioning for Daniel to sit at a nearby table. The question started innocuously enough: why he'd chosen to host the dinner, how he felt about the protesters' message, what he hoped to achieve. But as the interview progressed, Daniel's questions grew sharper, probing at the perceived hypocrisy of running a restaurant that served meat while claiming to support ethical practices. "I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers," Mark said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just trying to do the best I can with the resources I have. If that makes me a hypocrite in some people's eyes, so be it. But I believe that small steps matter, even if they don't please everyone." Daniel's pen paused, his gaze lingering on Mark for a moment before he nodded. "Fair enough," he said. "One last question. Do you think this dinner changed anything?" Mark thought about the protesters' expressions as they left the night before, some guarded, others thoughtful. He thought about Sarah's parting words, about the conversations that had unfolded around the table. "I think it planted a seed," he said finally. "Whether it grows or not is up to them." Daniel left soon after, and Mark returned to the kitchen, determined to focus on the task at hand. But the interview lingered in his mind, a weight he couldn't shake. By evening, the first signs of a storm began to brew. The article was published online with the headline, "Dinner with the Enemy, a restaurateur's attempt to appease vegan protesters sparks debate." The piece was well written and surprisingly balanced, highlighting both Mark's intentions and the skepticism of the protesters. But the comments section was another story entirely, a battleground of clashing opinions. Some readers applauded Mark's efforts. "This is exactly the kind of dialogue we need more of. Kudos to him." Others were less charitable. "This guy is just trying to protect his bottom line. Don't fall for it." And then there were the extremists. "Boycott Thompson's table. If you eat here, you're complicit in animal cruelty." As the evening wore on, the online backlash spilled into the real world. Protesters began gathering outside the restaurant again, their numbers larger this time. They held signs with bold, accusatory slogans: "Ethics can't be served with a side of steak. Stop the hypocrisy."
The chants grew louder as the night went on, unsettling the diners inside. Mark did his best to maintain a calm exterior, but his staff was visibly shaken. Beth pulled him aside during a lull in service, her expression strained. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "They're scaring people off. We can't keep running the restaurant like this." "I know," Mark said, rubbing his temples. "But what can I do? I can't just shut down every time they show up." Beth hesitated, then said softly, "Maybe you should talk to Sarah again. She seems to be the one they listen to." Mark wasn't sure how he felt about reaching out to Sarah again, especially after the mixed reactions to their first encounter. But he knew Beth was right. If anyone could help de-escalate the situation, it was her. The next morning, Mark called Sarah, her number saved from the contact sheet she had filled out for the dinner. She answered after a few rings, her tone wary. "Mark," she said. "What do you want?" "I think we need to talk," he said. "In person." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she finally agreed. They met later that afternoon at a small park on the edge of town. Sarah arrived with her arms crossed, her expression guarded. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone clipped. Mark took a deep breath. "Look, I know we don't see eye to eye, but this is getting out of hand. The protests, the online attacks, they're not helping anyone. If anything, they're just making people dig their heels in deeper." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "So you're saying this is our fault?" "No," Mark said quickly. "I'm saying it's not productive. If the goal is to create change, there has to be a better way. All this does is polarize people even more." Sarah was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more thoughtful. "Do you even understand why we're so angry?" she asked. I think I do, Mark said. But maybe I don't fully get it. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Help me understand. The conversation that followed was raw and unfiltered. Sarah spoke passionately about the systemic issues she believed Mark's industry perpetuated, the suffering of animals, the environmental impact, the culture of indifference. Mark listened intently, occasionally interjecting with his own perspective. By the time they parted ways, the tension between them had lessened, replaced by a fragile understanding. Sarah agreed to speak with her group about finding more constructive ways to advocate for their cause. But as Mark walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from resolved. And he was right. The following week brought an unexpected twist that would change everything. An anonymous email landed in Mark's inbox, claiming to have information that could expose the protesters' leader as a hypocrite. Attached were photos of Sarah dining at a high-end restaurant, a steak prominently featured on her plate. Mark stared at the email, his stomach churning. If the photos were real, they could discredit Sarah and weaken the protests. But the idea of using them felt wrong, like stooping to the very tactics he had tried to rise above. As he debated what to do, he realized this was more than a personal dilemma. It was a test of his integrity, a moment that could define not just his restaurant, but the kind of person he wanted to be. Little did he know, the decision he was about to make would set off a chain reaction with consequences far beyond what he could imagine. Mark sat in his office long after the restaurant had closed for the night, staring at his laptop screen. The email with its damning photos of Sarah sat unopened in front of him. The temptation to click on the attachments gnawed at him, but so did his conscience. This wasn't who he wanted to be, someone who wielded blackmail to silence his critics. And yet, the protests were hurting his business, his staff, and his peace of mind. He needed a solution, but was this the way? Beth knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. She carried a cup of tea and a look of concern. "You've been in here for hours," she said, setting the cup on his desk. "What's going on?" Mark gestured to the screen. "I got this earlier today. Someone sent me photos of Sarah eating steak at a fancy restaurant. If I leak them, it could discredit her and maybe put an end to all this." Beth's eyes widened as she sat down across from him. "Are you seriously considering it?" "I don't know," Mark admitted. "It feels wrong, but I don't know how else to stop them." Beth leaned forward, her voice firm. "Mark, if you do this, you're no better than the people trying to tear you down. You've always prided yourself on your integrity. Don't let this change who you are." Mark nodded slowly, her words resonating with him. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "You're right. I can't do it." Relief washed over Beth's face, but before she could respond, the phone on Mark's desk buzzed. He glanced at the caller ID, it was Sarah. Surprised, he picked up. "Mark, we need to talk," Sarah said, her tone urgent. "What's going on?" he asked. "Not over the phone. Can we meet tomorrow?" Mark agreed, his curiosity piqued. After hanging up, he looked at Beth. "Something's up." The next morning, they met at the same park where they'd spoken before. Sarah's usual confidence was replaced with unease. She looked around nervously before speaking. "Mark, I don't know how to say this, but someone's trying to blackmail me," she said, her voice trembling. "They sent me photos from a dinner I had years ago, back when I wasn't vegan yet. They're threatening to release them if I don't call off the protests." Mark's stomach sank. He realized immediately that the email he'd received wasn't just a random tip, it was part of a calculated attack against Sarah. "I got those same photos," he admitted. "I didn't open them, but someone sent them to me with the same implication." Sarah's face fell, and for the first time, Mark saw the vulnerable side of her. "I've worked so hard to build this movement. If those photos get out, it'll destroy everything." Mark took a deep breath. "I'm not going to use them, Sarah. That's not who I am. But we need to figure out who's behind this and why. Their uneasy truce turned into a reluctant partnership as they tried to uncover the source of the blackmail. Mark reached out to Daniel Meyer, the journalist who had written about their dinner, hoping he could help. Daniel agreed to look into it, intrigued by the potential story. Meanwhile, the protests continued, though Sarah's group seemed less organized. She was distracted, her leadership faltering under the weight of the looming threat. Mark noticed that fewer protesters showed up each day, and those who did seemed unsure of their purpose. One evening, as Mark was locking up the restaurant, a shadowy figure approached him. It was a man in his late 30s, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses. He handed Mark an envelope without a word before disappearing into the night. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message, "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." There was no signature, no clue as to who had sent it. Mark's heart raced as he showed the note to Beth later that night. "This is getting dangerous," she said, her worry evident. "Maybe you should call the police." "I can't," Mark said. "Not yet. We don't even know who we're dealing with." The next few days were a whirlwind. Daniel uncovered a possible lead, a rival restaurant owner named Victor Larson, known for his underhanded tactics. Victor had a history of sabotaging competitors and stirring up controversy to weaken his opposition. Daniel suspected that Victor had orchestrated the protests against Mark's restaurant, hoping to damage its reputation and draw customers to his own establishment. Mark couldn't believe the length someone would go to for the sake of business. He decided it was time to confront Victor, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He enlisted Sarah's help, knowing that her group had been unwitting pawns in Victor's scheme. Together, they devised a plan to expose Victor. Sarah arranged for her group to stage a peaceful protest outside Victor's restaurant, drawing attention from the media. Meanwhile, Mark and Daniel would gather evidence linking Victor to the blackmail and the orchestrated protests. The night of the protest arrived, and Sarah's group held signs advocating for ethical dining practices, carefully avoiding direct accusations against Victor. The media presence was strong, and Victor's discomfort was evident as he tried to maintain his composure for the cameras. Inside Victor's office, Mark and Daniel searched for incriminating evidence. They found emails and documents that clearly outlined Victor's plan to sabotage Thompson's Table and manipulate the vegan movement for his own gain. Daniel photographed everything, ensuring they had proof. As the protest outside grew larger, Victor stormed out to confront the crowd. "This is harassment," he shouted, his face red with anger. "You have no right to disrupt my business." Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We're not here to disrupt. We're here to stand for what we believe in. But maybe you should explain why you've been targeting other businesses to boost your own." Victor's face turned pale as the reporters turned their cameras on him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. At that moment, Mark and Daniel emerged from the restaurant, holding a folder of evidence. "Maybe this will refresh your memory," Mark said, handing the folder to one of the reporters. The crowd erupted as the contents of the folder were revealed, emails detailing Victor's schemes, financial records showing payments to individuals who had helped stage protests, and even the blackmail photos of Sarah. Victor tried to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. The media coverage was relentless, and within days, Victor's reputation was in ruins. His restaurant faced boycotts, and legal action loomed on the horizon. For Mark and Sarah, the ordeal brought an unexpected sense of closure. The protests outside Thompson's Table ceased, and Sarah's group shifted their focus to more constructive advocacy efforts. Mark offered to collaborate with them on initiatives that aligned with his values, such as hosting plant-based cooking classes and sourcing more sustainable ingredients. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also forced Mark and Sarah to see each other in a new light. They realized that while their methods and beliefs might differ, their goals were not so far apart. As the dust settled, Mark reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had faced challenges that tested his integrity, his resilience, and his ability to forgive. But through it all, he had held on to the belief that dialogue and understanding could overcome even the deepest divides. Thompson's Table thrived in the months that followed, not just as a restaurant but as a symbol of community and compromise. Mark knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face whatever came next, confident that he had stayed true to himself and his principles. The months following Victor Larsson's public downfall brought a quiet sense of relief to Mark Thompson, but it wasn't without challenges. The community, while supportive of his perseverance through the ordeal, had developed an insatiable curiosity about the restaurant and the events that had transpired. People began to frequent Thompson's Table not only for the food but to see the place where such a scandal had unfolded. It was good for business, but the constant questions about Victor and the protests wore on Mark. He longed for things to settle back into normalcy, but normal felt like a distant memory. Sarah, on the other hand, was navigating her own transformation. The revelation of Victor's manipulation had shaken her group to its core. Many members questioned their trust in her leadership, feeling betrayed that they had been used as pawns. Sarah took the criticism seriously and made it her mission to rebuild the trust she had lost. She spent weeks meeting with members one-on-one, listening to their concerns and reaffirming her commitment to their shared cause. Slowly, her dedication began to mend the fractures within the group. Despite their initial animosity, Mark and Sarah found themselves working together more frequently. Sarah had proposed a series of vegan-friendly events at Thompson's Table as a way to demonstrate that collaboration was possible. Mark, seeing an opportunity to bring something positive out of the chaos, agreed. Together, they planned a community table series, weekly dinners that showcased plant-based dishes and brought people together to discuss sustainability and ethical eating. The first event was met with skepticism. Regular patrons of Thompson's Table were unsure about the idea of a vegan menu, while members of Sarah's group questioned her decision to partner with someone they had once protested against. Mark and Sarah knew they were taking a risk, but they were determined to make it work. On the night of the first community table dinner, Mark stood in the kitchen, overseeing the preparation of dishes he'd never served before. His staff had been hesitant at first, but their culinary curiosity had taken over. They worked diligently, perfecting dishes like roasted cauliflower steaks with chimichurri, wild mushroom risotto, and a decadent vegan chocolate mousse. As the guests began to arrive, the dining room buzzed with an unusual mix of energy. Longtime patrons of the restaurant sat alongside Sarah's supporters, their interactions polite but guarded. Mark and Sarah moved through the room, greeting guests and encouraging conversation. It was clear that both sides were stepping out of their comfort zones. As the evening progressed, the tension began to melt away. The food was a revelation, surprising even the most skeptical diners. Mark watched as people who had once stood on opposite sides of the protest line exchanged smiles and stories. Sarah's group shared their passion for ethical eating, while Thompson's Table regulars spoke about their love for the restaurant and its welcoming atmosphere. By the end of the night, the room was filled with laughter and lively discussion. The success of the first community table dinner inspired Mark and Sarah to continue the series. Each week brought new themes and opportunities to explore the intersections of their perspectives. Mark began to see the value in plant-based cuisine, not just as a trend but as a way to connect with a broader audience. Sarah, meanwhile, gained a deeper appreciation for the challenges of running a restaurant and the complexities of balancing ethics with business. Their collaboration didn't go unnoticed. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a tale of reconciliation and community building. Articles highlighted the unlikely partnership between a restaurateur and an activist, celebrating their efforts to bridge divides and foster understanding. The attention brought even more people to Thompson's Table, eager to experience the community table dinners and witness the dynamic between Mark and Sarah. But not everyone was on board with their newfound partnership. A small faction of Sarah's group, led by a vocal critic named Lisa, accused her of selling out. Lisa had been a staunch supporter of Sarah during the protests but now viewed her collaboration with Mark as a betrayal of their cause. She began organizing counter-events and spreading rumors, claiming that the community table dinners were nothing more than a publicity stunt. Sarah was hurt by Lisa's actions but refused to let them derail her progress. She reached out to Lisa, hoping to find common ground, but the conversation quickly turned confrontational. Lisa accused Sarah of compromising her principles and undermining the group's mission. Sarah, maintaining her composure, explained that the collaboration was about building bridges and creating lasting change, but Lisa remained unconvinced. Mark, hearing about the conflict, offered his support. He reminded Sarah that progress often came with resistance and that their efforts were making a tangible difference. Together, they brainstormed ways to address the criticism and ensure that their message remained authentic. One idea was to invite skeptics like Lisa to participate in the community table dinners, giving them a platform to share their perspectives and contribute to the dialogue. It was a risky move, but Mark and Sarah believed that inclusivity was the key to overcoming divisions. They extended an invitation to Lisa, hoping she would see the opportunity for what it was. To their surprise, Lisa accepted. On the night of her participation, the atmosphere in the dining room was tense. Lisa arrived with a group of supporters, their skepticism evident. Mark and Sarah greeted them warmly, emphasizing that the evening was about open conversation and mutual respect. As the dinner progressed, the tension began to ease. Lisa and her group engaged in the discussions, sharing their concerns and challenging some of the ideas presented. Mark and Sarah listened attentively, acknowledging the validity of their points and offering thoughtful responses. By the end of the night, Lisa admitted that while she still had reservations, she appreciated the effort to create dialogue and build understanding. The turning point came when Lisa, inspired by the conversations, proposed a joint event that combined elements of the community table dinners with an educational workshop on sustainable food systems. Mark and Sarah eagerly agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to expand their reach and deepen their impact. The joint event was a resounding success. Held in a local community center, it featured cooking demonstrations, panel discussions, and interactive activities. People from all walks of life attended, eager to learn and connect. The event showcased the power of collaboration, proving that even the most divided groups could find common ground. As the months passed, the Community Table series became a cornerstone of Thompson's Table, attracting diners from across the city and beyond. Mark and Sarah's partnership continued to evolve, their shared experiences forging a deep bond. They realized that their initial conflict had been rooted in misunderstanding and that their differences were a source of strength rather than division. For Mark, the journey had been transformative. He had faced challenges that tested his character and forced him to reevaluate his values. Through it all, he had emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to making a positive impact. Sarah, too, had grown as a leader, learning the importance of empathy and adaptability in the pursuit of change. Together, they had turned a moment of conflict into a movement of connection, proving that even the most unlikely partnerships could create something extraordinary. Their story became a testament to the power of dialogue, resilience, and the belief that understanding could bridge even the deepest divides. As the years passed, Thompson's Table became more than just a restaurant, it became a symbol of unity and transformation for the entire community. What had started as a place for fine dining had evolved into a hub for discussion, learning, and change. Mark Thompson's vision for the future was clear: to create a space where diverse perspectives could converge, and where food could be a medium for understanding. The partnership with Sarah had not only helped achieve this but had also taken it to heights Mark had never imagined. Sarah herself had found new purpose through the Community Table series and other collaborative projects. She became a sought-after speaker on ethical eating and community engagement, often crediting her partnership with Mark as the catalyst for her renewed mission. Together, they had shown the world that even the most polarized viewpoints could find harmony through honest dialogue and shared goals. But the work was far from over. Mark and Sarah knew that maintaining momentum required continuous innovation and dedication. They brainstormed new ways to expand their impact, deciding to take their message beyond the confines of Thompson's Table. One idea was to host traveling events in other cities, replicating the success of their community table dinners while tailoring the approach to the unique needs and challenges of each locale. They also began recording the events, sharing them as video series to inspire others around the world. Their first traveling event took them to a neighboring city with its own share of divisions between traditional industries and progressive movements. The location was a former industrial hub grappling with economic decline and an influx of new ideas about sustainability and urban renewal. The local tensions mirrored those Mark and Sarah had faced, making it the perfect testing ground for their approach. Preparation for the event was intensive. Mark worked with his team to design a menu that celebrated the region's culinary heritage while introducing plant-based innovations. Sarah reached out to local activists and business owners, inviting them to participate in panels and discussions. They secured a historic building in the heart of the city for the event, transforming it into a welcoming space with communal tables and vibrant decor. When the night of the event arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The room was filled with a mix of people: farmers, chefs, activists, factory workers, and curious residents eager to see what the buzz was about. Mark and Sarah kicked off the evening with a heartfelt speech, sharing their journey and inviting everyone to approach the night with an open mind and a willingness to connect. As the dishes were served, the conversations began to flow. People who had never spoken before found themselves laughing over shared memories or debating issues they cared deeply about. A local farmer, initially skeptical of the plant-based focus, praised a dish that featured a creative use of his produce. An activist commended the inclusion of a traditional regional recipe reimagined in a sustainable way. The event was a resounding success, leaving attendees inspired and hopeful about the possibilities of collaboration. Buoyed by this success, Mark and Sarah decided to formalize their efforts, establishing a non-profit organization called The Common Table. Its mission was to bring people together through food, fostering understanding and addressing pressing social issues. The non-profit quickly gained traction, receiving support from businesses, community leaders, and individuals who believed in their vision. Through The Common Table, Mark and Sarah organized workshops, culinary training programs, and community-building initiatives. One particularly impactful program was a mentorship initiative for young chefs from underprivileged backgrounds. Participants were taught not only cooking techniques but also the importance of empathy, resilience, and leadership. Mark took a personal interest in the program, seeing it as a way to pass on the lessons he had learned through his journey. Sarah, meanwhile, focused on expanding the educational component of their work. She developed a series of workshops that explored the intersection of food, culture, and ethics, inviting experts from diverse fields to contribute. Her ability to navigate complex conversations with grace and authenticity made her a natural leader, and her workshops became a cornerstone of the Common Table's offerings. As the Common Table grew, so did its influence. The organization was invited to participate in national conferences and collaborate on policy initiatives aimed at addressing food insecurity and promoting sustainable practices. Mark and Sarah found themselves at the forefront of a movement that was reshaping how communities approached food and its role in society. Their efforts also had a profound impact on Thompson's Table itself. The restaurant became a model for sustainable practices, implementing initiatives like zero-waste kitchens, partnerships with local farmers, and educational events for diners. Mark's staff embraced the changes, proud to be part of something larger than themselves. Regular patrons marveled at how the restaurant had evolved while still maintaining the warmth and excellence they had always loved. Despite their success, Mark and Sarah remained grounded. They knew that their journey had been shaped not just by their efforts but by the support and contributions of countless others. They made it a point to give back, using their platform to amplify the voices of those who often went unheard. Whether it was a small farmer struggling to stay afloat or a young activist fighting for change, Mark and Sarah ensured that the common table was a place where everyone had a seat. One of the most memorable moments of their journey came during the nonprofit's 5th anniversary celebration. The event was held at Thompson's Table, bringing together people from all walks of life who had been touched by their work. The evening was filled with laughter, tears, and stories of transformation. Mark and Sarah took a moment to reflect on how far they had come, marveling at the ripple effects of their unlikely partnership. During the celebration, a young woman approached them, her eyes filled with emotion. She introduced herself as Mia, a graduate of the mentorship program. She shared how the program had changed her life, giving her the skills and confidence to pursue her dream of opening her own restaurant. Mia's words were a poignant reminder of the power of connection and the importance of paying it forward. As the night drew to a close, Mark and Sarah stood side by side, watching as their guests mingled and laughed. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had been worth every challenge. They had taken a moment of conflict and turned it into a movement of unity, proving that even the deepest divides could be bridged through compassion, dialogue, and the simple act of sharing a meal. In the years that followed, Mark and Sarah continued to push boundaries, always looking for new ways to inspire and connect. Their story became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of collaboration. And while the world around them continued to change, one thing remained constant: the belief that no matter how different we may seem, we all have a place at the common table.